All right, Latte, one more take. Are Nuance Conversations as important to you as they are to me? Do you support independent media? Well, I could use your support. Joyful Productions and shows like this, they're a one-man passion project, and you can become a patron. As a patron, you get access to the green room chatter that I do before every episode with guests and with regulars. You also get access to the retired episode archive and a whole bunch of other stuff. So please go to patreon.com/Joyful Productions and become a patron today.
This is Random Badassery.
So this whole is kind of kismet how this happened, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Like I listened to your podcast and I was thinking, I'd like to have him on sometime, and I didn't really know what we're going to talk about. And then you put out that tweet, and I was like, what does that mean? I want to know more about that. So I think you have an interesting perspective on technology, because you're. I don't remember who it was you were talking to, but you said you had 1 foot in hippiedom and 1 foot in, and I can't remember what the other side was, but it was something along the business world. There you go. And I think that gives you a really interesting perspective.
And the business world is essentially synonymous with technology now.
Right. Especially in the Bay Area where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the tweet was something you were talking about, the book Range, David Epstein's book Range.
Yeah. So essentially he went and he found out that with each generation, our ability to work with and trade in abstract concepts is getting better with each generation. So there's some sort of test of how well somebody deals with abstract concepts. And there's also tests for IQ. IQ remains stable throughout the generation. So the distribution of IQ remains stable throughout each successive generation. But with abstract concepts, we're getting better with each generation. And it makes me think of something about writing, so that we're writing a lot, and that the invention of writing is changing culture. And then there's this feedback loop. And now he didn't talk about this in the book Range, but I've been thinking about Google, and Google is semantic search. So it has to do with our ability to work with the written word and find answers to the questions that we have using the written word. And this ties into something I do, which is called spaced repetition memorization, and which sparked that tweet. So there's a software that I basically test myself. I come up with questions, and then I have an answer to those questions, and it's a flashcard system where I test myself, and then I see the thing. And if I get it right, then it places it way in the future to test me again at some point. It's based on an algorithm. And I'm using this isn't good for like high level concepts, but it's really good for learning a new language. And I'm learning that a lot of things the beginning stages are about learning a language. So I'm now getting into how the immune system works. And, I just learned this word, cytotoxic killer cells. And these are the cells that go out and attack infectious things. And that cytotoxic, if I have to figure out that word and really build a visualization in my head, a model in my head of what that is, and see it go, in my mind, imagination, go see it and do it. And until I built that model, I can't effectively search for it. And so it's not in my lexicon. And so I'm noticing that through the spaced repetition, I'm expanding my own ability to deal with abstract concepts and trade in them and talk about them and all these things. And that's affecting my ability to search on Google. So it's widening my sphere where I can get into these really, really long tail things. And the cool thing about biology is that it's all there. There's a lot of open-ended questions about how the body works, but we've got like 80% of how the body works down to a science. But then the cool thing is that we can, and what I love, because I have a background in body work as well, is that a lot of scientists look at the very, very, very small and try to break things into their component parts. But the thing about body work is that the body is a system. It's a closed system. So you have to look at the system itself. And so you can take these things and then build a new meaning on it, which might be right, might be wrong. I don't know. But that can change how we work with this body that we inhabit. So that was a long way of answering that question.
Well, the long ways are the interesting ones. If it was like a 2-word answer, we wouldn't have much of a podcast, would we?
Yeah, there'd be no reason for that.
Well, what I was thinking about is the Feynman technique. While you were talking about that, are you familiar with Feynman technique?
I've heard of it, but I don't know it.
It's essentially, boil it down to like 2 sentences, which is actually the whole point of the Feynman technique. Is if you can explain it, then you understand it. So if you can take like an abstract concept and give me 3 sentences where I go, oh, okay, I get what you're talking about, that means you actually understand it. So what he suggests is when you're working on studying something is to try to explain it to somebody.
And this goes back to the other Kismet, because we found each other on Twitter, because that's exactly why I'm trying to use Twitter. Is that I made a realization about probably about a year ago that I don't really care about the social proof of Twitter. I did care about it, and I was using it to try to grow my audience and grow my things. And then at a certain point, I realized that, oh wait, learning. I can use this thing to learn. So I just as I did with that tweet, I brought something I learned from this book and shared it, so that I could learn it and learn it better. And that's the cool thing. And, we were talking before the show about questions and how I now use Twitter to ask questions. And that is it's just totally changed how I use it. And I no longer view social media as a waste of time, because I'm essentially adapting the way I use it to a goal of testing myself and learning, spaced repetition.
One of the things I didn't tell you in the green room chatter, which is funny, it didn't even occur to me, this asking questions thing is something a long time ago. I had a Facebook page for the podcast. Actually, it was for Holy Fool, which is long story. There was a period of time where I had multiple podcasts, and I would ask questions every day. But it relates to what you were saying, the Twitter works better because of the shorter spaces for people to answer than Facebook. But also, I made a terrible mistake going back also to what we were talking about, making mistakes and learning. I would ask these questions, but I didn't interact with the answers. I just asked, it was like it was content. I just put out the question and okay, I put up something today, and then I go on with whatever I was doing. Terrible.
And this is I'm very, very guilty of this, and I am still not guilty. I go through periods where I can then respond, but because I'm asking so many questions in so many random places, I am very much treating it like content, and I feel really bad. Well, I'm sorry, I used to feel really bad, and now I've gotten over feeling bad, which might be, I don't know who that's good for, but I like everything. I make sure to like every single thing. So at least I'm doing that. But
well, I think there's a limit, right? You don't want to, especially I think for the type of podcasts that you and I do, there's a lot of mental work that has to go into, even for this conversation, I wanted to talk about specific things in here. Well, I need to come in with some sort of fluency and feel a little bit prepared to talk about things. And that's mental work. Well, if I'm spending, 3 hours on Twitter, there's at least 2.5 hours there that I should have been using for something else. So there is that limit. But I think that I haven't even figured out specifically what our topic is, but I think it revolves around this idea of the tools, and especially technology tools, because I think that, your comment about Google for fluency, and then also the way that you use Twitter, you're using tools in an unexpected way. And I think that seeing the way that you use Twitter has actually changed the way that I use Twitter. And I've for just really rethinking the way that it can function. Oh, this is a really good way to actually communicate. Well, duh, that's what it was made for. But we get caught up in the likes and all of that, the numbers and all of that bullshit. I only have 22 followers. So that's 22 people you could talk to. And coming back to that, in a way, it's like a metaphor for your breath work, coming back to the breath, while coming back to the conversation. The Google thing, I want to talk a little bit more about that. So do you think that the algorithm of Google plays into that expanding of fluency, or is it all you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I was talking about this with somebody recently who was more in this kind of do good space of creating something. And they said that Google was a prime way that people get radicalized, because both with Google and with YouTube, you search for something and then they give you more of what you're searching for. So they delve deeper and deeper and deeper into something. And so he mentioned this story of essentially this guy who started out searching for something, I can't remember what it was, that isn't necessarily tied to extremism, but then Google, it is like subtly, and then it took one step closer to extremism, and then you can see this process of this guy getting radicalized through this content that he's getting. So I think it's an interesting. I mean, to really answer that question, we have to investigate what is this thing that I call I, or what is this thing that you call you. And that is a deep philosophical question, and it's not quite clear. If anybody investigates that question, it's not quite clear what the answer is. But functionally, speaking about this you and I, there's something I've recently thought. I go on YouTube and I go on Google with a search mentality, so I'm looking for a piece of information. But a lot of people go on YouTube with a entertainment, I just want to be consumed. And there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. Except if you aren't kind of getting into this feedback loop where you're also providing, where you're taking that knowledge and then testing it and sharing it. And so I don't have an answer specifically to that question of whether it's me or whether it's the algorithm, but it's a good question, and I'd love to hear your answer on it too.
Well, specifically going back to the radicalization part of it, I had mentioned to you in our interactions before, through email and stuff, that there was Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism. And a book I read before that was Jaron Lanier's 10 Reasons to Delete Your Social Media Accounts Today. Really long title. I probably got at least one or two words wrong there. But one of the things that he says in there and then is mirrored in Zuboff's work is that these algorithms, specifically Google, Facebook, Twitter, they optimize for spectacle. In the sense that I think it's drawn to what you're saying there about the idea of entertainment. Most people, or not most people, many people go to these things for entertainment. I think they're coming from the perspective that everyone goes there for entertainment. So these algorithms favor that type of thing. So for example, recently I've been rethinking the way that I use Google. I stopped using Google completely for a really long time. And now I use it whenever I'm searching for something for the show, because I want to try to use their algorithm to my benefit. To, if I'm looking up something about, one of your favorite topics, cryptocurrency. If I'm looking up something about cryptocurrency, I want them to start filtering that into this identity that they're building that's attached to the show account, and feed that in so that, whatever they're pushing in front of me, it takes that into account. So then maybe I'll end up in different places, like you were saying, to expand.
I've got a good idea for you. So the way that technologists do this is they run an A/B test. And so you could run an A/B test with Google and DuckDuckGo. Because DuckDuckGo doesn't build an identity on you. You can actually evaluate how much Google is providing you a spectacle versus a one that doesn't. It also gets me into thinking about building new technology, because we as a society are adapting, and I have an ideal in my head. I have a wish, I have a hope that people like you and people like me and people like Simulation Series and other people are exploring nuance, and that there is a demand for it, but that demand has not been cultivated. And so I have a hope that there is this kind of silent majority that has existed for a long time, that used to read a lot of newspapers and intellectual stuff, but didn't have the power to comment. I believe that silent majority still exists, and I believe that it's kind of waiting and kind of like adapting to this new environment where media is more outrageous and more spectacle and more all this different stuff. And I hope that we can essentially find that and motivate that to be more outspoken, to speak, essentially.
Right. I think that's going back to part of the reasoning of why I went back to Google for the show stuff. I almost felt like I had a responsibility, in the sense that obviously I don't want Google knowing my personal stuff. So if I'm searching for something that has something to do with me personally, I use DuckDuckGo and I use Safari.
Oh, you're already doing it.
Yeah, I've been doing that for like 6 months. I haven't done A/B testing though.
Yeah.
But I'll go there for my personal stuff. But for the show stuff, I'll go to Google because if I'm searching these nuanced topics, I want that fed into their algorithm. I want them to know that there's interest in that. So by not contributing to that, I started to realize I'm like, oh, I'm part of the problem. If I'm removing myself from that algorithm, then it's almost like democracy. I no longer have a vote. So I've been trying to, I guess maybe in my small way, to tweak the outrage or the spectacle, I should say. Like, oh, all of a sudden people are really interested in this. Why? Oh, because, it spreads. And I think you're right. Maybe it is waiting. Maybe it's like a dormant virus.
And what I like to do on my show is find the question that we're answering right now. And the question to me, the question that we just discussed is essentially, how can you balance anonymity versus participation? Because knowing that pure anonymity is an ideal and it's never going to be reached, and pure participation is also an ideal and never going to be reached. And also, how can we contribute to these things where we're also receiving?
Mm-hmm. It's very much akin to when we think about it in something most of us are familiar with is politics. Mm-hmm. There's the idea of like, democracy doesn't work, so I don't vote. Well, now you have no opportunity to affect democracy. So, or they say, change the system from the inside. That's something many of us grew up hearing. Well, when it comes to these technologies, what I'm realizing is, yes, Lanier is correct and Zuboff is absolutely correct about what these companies are doing. But I think Lanier might be wrong about removing yourself from them, because now they operate with the assumption that they're doing everything right. Mm. But if you're actually in there and slowly tweaking and adding those little viruses to their program, that's metaphorical for all you hackers out there, then it changes. If everybody thinks that everybody in the room's in agreement, then the assumption is that everybody's in agreement. It takes people to say, I don't agree with that.
And this gets into something ancient and very old, which is that, and for lack of a better word, in part of a spiritual tradition, not only in the West but in the East, that there is something that happens once we start to question the nature of reality and start to do these various practices that are esoteric. We start to essentially desire to remove ourselves from everything because everything is corrupt. That's the thought. And what you just said, it kind of alluded to that in the sense like, oh, Google is corrupt and TV is corrupt. All these things are corrupt. So I must remove myself in order to be pure. And then that's a very common thing. Like people go off into monasteries for their whole lives. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with going off and onto a monastery and devoting your life to this search for higher truth, except that there is no higher truth there. Like the higher truth comes from this participation in life, knowing that it's corrupt and knowing that it will never be pure, and knowing that the ideal is not something that is reachable.
It's the idea of, which is, by the way, you pretty much encapsulated where I was for like 6 months, just slowly removing myself from things that I thought were corrupt, and then realizing now, oh, I'm not helping. But the image of the old man with the white beard and the long hair on the top of the mountain, meditating on the peak of the mountain, he's not doing the world any good. He's not doing it any harm, but he's not doing it any good. I think it's, can't remember the name of the Nietzsche book, but it begins with the character doing exactly that. But then he comes back into the village. He has to bring what he's learned back. And I'd never connected that. And I don't know why. There's a wonderful book by Colin Wilson called The Outsider. And it is about outsider culture. It's about people who look at themselves as outsider, and the outsider serves a purpose in society. People think that the outsider is permanently outside, but that's not true. The purpose and the job of the outsider is to step outside and be outside of the tribe so that when they come in, they can bring the perspective that they saw from the outside. They're still part of that system. They can't escape that social system.
Yeah. There's so many, it's going back to that Kismet, is like, this has been on my mind a lot. And the person I just reached out to for an interview on my own show, Felix Chandler, who's been a good friend for a long time. We met in Bangkok, Thailand, when we were both studying abroad there, and studying abroad and kind of removing myself from my own culture, finding a new culture, going into immersion in that culture. And then we went on a bunch of adventures together, ended up like traveling all over the world, riding motorbikes through Latin America, learning a bunch of different languages, and just having kind of adventures. And both of us have always felt like outsiders. But then as an outsider, you can't be totally outside because you're dependent. We're all dependent on the system, the food system, capitalism, we're all dependent on it. So you can't be totally outside. And so we would find ourselves basically moving from group to group to group, but never really connecting or feeling like we are part of these subcultures. And this is essentially, the internet is like the subculture manufacturing machine or subculture connecting machine, where it connects different subcultures, create new subcultures, and allows people to find their tribe, so to speak. But then for those of us who just don't feel a part of something, which may sound like, to somebody listening to this, might sound really, really lonely. But in fact, for me, it hasn't been that lonely. It's just kind of been the nature of who I am. It's just like, I don't connect, I connect individually with people, but I don't connect to a sub tribe, although I love learning about them and reading about them and temporarily becoming part of them, but never really being part of it. So that's something interesting. I don't really have anything more to say on that.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way, to be honest. I was just thinking about that the other day. I'm like, I am really self-contained. Mm-hmm. and not in like a self-congratulatory way. It was almost just in like almost a surprise way to realize like, like when I go through problems and stuff like that, I don't reach out to people. Not in the sense that I'm incapable of asking for help when I need it, but more in the sense that I'm emotionally contained within myself. I deal with my problems within myself. I don't actually reach out to talk about it. And it's probably, to some degree, there's probably some negative to that, but it's not a bad thing. It's just the way that I'm only child. I grew up emotionally self-contained. Mm-hmm. But these tools, technology, they do serve the purpose of giving outsiders, we get a bigger window. Before we had a small window, now we have an even bigger window. But every piece of technology, of course, it has two sides, right? For every positive, we get something negative out of something. I think that's something people maybe seem to be forgetting, is there is no perfect tool. There will be no tool that's all benefit with no negative. Computers brought so much as far as computational power, but then they've also brought us outrage. There's so many different.
They didn't bring us outrage. They made the outrage more apparent and more easily spread.
Right. Yeah, because TV did that a little bit less, and then radio did that a little bit less. But it's slowly been building with each technology, right? Yep. But for people on the outside, that's a bigger window, more to observe, more to see. But then also, flat Earth was kind of like a null topic until people were able to create groups online that made it seem like there was more of them.
Find your tribe, even if it believes that there's a flat Earth.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's one of the things like I joked about in the last episode I did with my co-host. I said, maybe one day I might do an episode on flat Earth. Like, just what do they think? Like, can we look at it from an objective perspective, and not to legitimize it, but just to look at it? And I think that's the outsider perspective, if I've ever heard of it, right? Is to look at something and go, what is that? Without having to feel like you have to engage in the sense of, to take a side on something. And I think that maybe that's why it's so hard for people to understand people like Sam Harris or Joe Rogan, what they're doing, is because a lot of people are automatically associative to taking sides. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way that they function. They don't have the outsider. They have insider mentality. But an outsider is able to look at things and go, oh, look at that. Look at those two dogs fighting. I don't need to pick which dog. I'm just watching two dogs fight.
There's a lot we could go into from there. From Robert Sapolsky, we know that the hierarchy and the hierarchy is a basic fundamental foundation of at least primates, at least chimpanzees, very, very likely human beings, very, very likely a lot of other animals, probably even to the cellular level. And that maybe even since the Cambrian explosion or life itself, there is a hierarchy. Yet what you mentioned about the observer, and so that is a highly, highly innate drive that we want to become an insider. Yet there are these people, for whatever reason, who are outsiders, and maybe it's not people, because what you're getting into is essentially a spiritual question as well. It's like, and a spiritual technique and tool that we can use, which is to notice the observer. So, I'm talking and I'm observing myself talking. And then if I ask myself, who is that? What is that thing? Or who is that thing that's observing the person talking? If I can ask that question, then it means that whatever is talking is not me, because I am the thing observing it. But that gets into a really tricky hall of mirrors, because if you then ask, what is the observer observing that person talking? And then what is the observer of that observer? It gets very hall of mirror likes, and you kind of have to give it up, because it's like, it's a hall of mirrors. So there's this weird thing, and this makes me think that these tools and techniques of meditation, they all point to something. Like you were saying, they're just tools, and we're never going to find the right tool. And that very, very much applies to this, for lack of a better word, spiritual thing as well, is that they're all tools and they're just pointing to something. And what is it that they're pointing to? That's the thing that we want. It's not the tool that gets us there. It's not the tool that shows us there. But where are they leading? Where is it leading? Why do humans have the ability to meditate? Why do humans have the ability to be observers when everything else in life, and even within the human being itself, is focused on this dominance hierarchy? And yet why are we allowed to watch it and observe it in a way that separates us?
Yeah, that brings up a question too. It's a really difficult question, but that's what we try to focus on. Is everybody capable of that, or are just some people capable of that?
I would argue that everyone is capable of it, as long as they have a certain intelligence. And I do not mean this at all in the IQ sense, although I do believe that a higher IQ might be able to get you faster there, but also might get in the way of it as well. Because if you get stuck in the mind, it's very, very difficult to notice what I'm talking about, because you identify directly with the mind. But I do believe that it is a common human thing. And I can show pretty much, I have been in my own personal experience, I can show somebody how they can do that. I've not found one person that I cannot bring to a slight realization of that they have this very basic awareness and very basic observance ability, this ability to observe everything that's occurring.
Do you ever worry that, there's, especially in the Bay Area, there's this kind of collision in some way, maybe to a more balanced degree? You represent this balance that we see coming through a lot of CEOs and technologists in the Bay Area, where they are interested in technology, but they're also interested in more spiritual, more mindful practices. Do you ever worry, though, that some of these people aren't actually getting the point of them, and they're actually using them as tools, but not proper tools? Like they're hacking them. Like, oh, if I do this, then I can do this more. They're not really getting the point of it.
This is the whole reason I started my show, Crazy Wisdom, is to go into that exact point. I'm not the first person to talk about it. And actually, I'm going to explain the name Crazy Wisdom, because that actually is very, very relevant to this. And this person I'm about to describe is not the reason why I named it Crazy Wisdom, nor is he the only one who talks about it. But there's a man named Chongyom Rinpoche, who's a Tibetan Lama who came to the United States, set up Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. And he was an alcoholic. He was crazy. And he also had a lot of wisdom. And so he had this term called crazy wisdom, which basically means that once you get beyond the mind, once you are able to see the mind for what it is, which is essentially a disease or a neurosis, and you can see it, and it's crazy, but crazy in a neurotic way. And once you get to see it from this backdrop, from this observer, there's a certain wisdom that arises that's actually really healthy and helpful. It's not only, he isn't the one who started this term. There's also another term within the Western mystical tradition called divine madness. And he also came up with another term, which is the term that's really important, called spiritual materialism. And I should say that he didn't come up with it. He pointed to it, and he was very cogent in his pointing to it. And the spiritual materialism is when we're working in the economy and when we're doing a job, and there's nothing wrong with having a job. It's really important that you have a job, that you do some work. We try to make material benefit, and we try to gain material benefit, and we do that through use of tools, and we make money, and that's all there. And then as soon as people start to get into this realm of spirituality and asking these important questions and figuring out what's going on, they start to then use those same tools and be like, well, everything's material. I'm going to use these material tools in order to get this. And so we start latching on to material things like yoga asana, putting ourselves in postures, creating this image of ourselves as like, oh, I'm doing the yoga, I'm eating the right things, I'm focusing on my breath in this particular way, and that's going to get me to this thing, and I'm going to get all the money and all the thing and all the effectiveness, all towards this material goal. And it's just repeating the same process in the material world, but it's not getting us anywhere. And yes, very much I agree that is happening in the Bay Area, and it's an issue because of power structures that, the Google founder is going to Burning Man, Headspace, all of these companies have a lot of power, and they're building the technology, and the technology is taking over the world, and everything's being mediated through these pipes. And they've got their, and then there's another theme, which is that the people building the technology, if you go to Ecstatic Dance here in San Francisco, they also have it down in San Jose. Most of the people there are engineers, people who have been building these products for a long time, and then found that it's all material and it's not fulfilling. It's not fulfilling in that deeper sense that will sustain us for longer. And because of that, they are now finding these techniques and tools and other things like that. And the reason I know it is because I went through it. I partly still do it. And it's like a very basic human thing. But if we're not aware of it, and many people here aren't aware of it, and that's why I'm doing the show, is hopefully to expand that awareness of that this is a thing, and that this is something that we should become aware of, or else it will bite you in the ass. And I know that because it bit me in the ass as well. And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered that question.
What's funny is all this time I never made the connection between holy fool and crazy wisdom. We're both basically coming from the same place. The holy fool is like the umbrella that I use for everything. The website is Holy Fool Productions because of that same idea.
Well,
that's so weird. But should we? I think we've used it a bunch of times. We might as well just say for the audience one more time: Kismet.
Yeah.
But yeah, what I worry about, I don't know why I specifically, when you said Headspace, I specifically went a place with that. And what I was thinking about is, so they're taking these systems, these spiritual systems, and they're putting them out, which to some degree they are doing good. They're giving people literally some headspace. But then I start thinking about the process of everything becoming technological, because it seems once things become technological, there's a 3-part process that just keeps looping forever, which is contain an idea, analyze what happens, and then manipulate. So contain, analyze, manipulate. Start over again. Contain, analyze, manipulate. Contain, analyze, manipulate. That's what Google does, right? So contain everything. Okay, so let's try to get everybody's email into Gmail. Everybody use Gmail. Now we've contained it. Now we analyze everything. And now that we have all this, we can manipulate. And then, we don't know what they're manipulating for. They could be manipulating for positive, but the fact is that's what's happening. And then it starts to, the problem with that is the first step, right? It's containment. So even though we may be manipulating things with the idea of making things better, through the process of containment, we're excluding things. And I think that also plays back in what we were saying about Twitter and all of these things. It's like, why is outrage and why are people becoming more and more tribal? It's because the nuance and all of that stuff is what is being left out of the containment. It's what's being pushed out.
And you can't contain it.
Yeah, because it continually changes, right? It's like water. You can contain water. Well, that's probably not a good metaphor. You can contain water.
Yeah.
It's like an idea.
And that's a very good point. Yeah. So that could get into the elements, and essentially, we have these elements, and I'm not talking about the elemental, the basic elements of life. I'm talking about like everything comes into these forms of water, earth, air, all these different things. But then what is the substrate of that? And what is in that? I would argue that that's awareness, because there is one thing that we can be sure of. I can be sure that I am aware. I'm relatively sure that you're aware, but I can't test that. And I'm relatively aware that everybody else is aware, but I can't test that. But I am sure that I am aware. And I do know that everything that I've ever learned, or everything that I've ever experienced, has been within this space of my awareness. Then getting into my awareness, whether it is my awareness, that's the key question. Because if it's not my awareness and you're aware and everything is within the space of awareness, then that leads me to believe that my individual awareness is just one small part of this greater awareness. And so I would say that nuance comes from this space of awareness being like, okay, I'm observing all of this stuff happening. I'm observing myself using this tool in order to gain this goal of manipulation. But then what is it that's aware of this whole thing? And that's where that space of nuance is like, oh, and then there's so much more. And then it is continuously changing, and everything is changing all the time. And that we start to do these things and we think they'll work forever, but then they don't work, and that they change, and then we have to figure it out again. And it's like this constant entropy, right? And then it gets into this negative entropy. Why life is this negative entropy force, this building up force, this creation force, but it's always battling in this yin and yang kind of thing with entropy, this thing that will eventually destroy the universe, but then maybe the universe will arise again. It's like, that's my answer to that.
So then what I'm wondering is, people could probably listen to this and think that, if they missed the parts where we talked about the tools that we use personally, they could think that we're saying not to use these things.
Exactly. Yeah.
But obviously you and I do, like we had a long conversation in the green room about some tools that we use and how we use them. How do we use these technological tools without being contained? How do we, in a less abstract way and more in a tangible way, how do you think that we can use them without being wrapped into it? Because we are being analyzed.
That's a really good question. I want to make it practical. As what I said could be very abstract, but for me, it's extremely practical because right now I can come back to the fact that I am aware, and just returning to that fact that I'm aware allows me to enter this space, which has now become a meme and a cliche, but beginner's mind, where that, or crazy wisdom, where that, or holy fool, where that divine madness can arise, and that openness and potentiality arises. And I believe that's the space where you can't analyze, because yes, Google is analyzing me as an individual. Actually, they are analyzing me as a data point. They aren't actually analyzing me as an individual.
Right.
And Facebook isn't analyzing me as a data point or as an individual. It's analyzing me as an individual, as a part of a subgroup. So they have mapped me out in terms of my subgroup directly, but I'm not just my subgroup. I'm a whole bunch of other things. Like Walt Whitman, you contain multitudes. There's a vast universe inside of me, and there's a vast universe inside of you, and anybody listening, there's a vast universe inside of them too. So it's like, I think the best way to do what you just said, to make it practical, is to come to an experiential understanding that you contain multitudes, and that these things are just capturing the personality or an aspect of the personality, I would say.
I think it's important to take that mindset too, and to never forget to, you have to remind yourself that you're being analyzed, and through that analysis, you're being manipulated in the sense that here's a great example. I looked up one article on the new Joker movie once, and now I get fed articles about the new Joker movie like 7 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't pay attention to the nuanced things that I looked up. I'm not getting fed as much of those things. So you have to remember that when you're automatically taking, in a passive sense, taking what is put forth before you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this brings to mind a question to make it even more practical. And I do not have an answer to this question. So right now we live in a time of relative stability. We've lived in stability since 1950s. Those of us in the developed countries, and even more so since the 1990s. And we may be entering a time of conflict. And so if there's a time of conflict, and these tools have been developed that are manipulating us, that's the question that I wonder about. Because when it comes down to it, and I've, Facebook has me mapped as a sub-identity, and we already know from the 2016 election that they can motivate that towards political goals. And then you got China, which is doing surveillance technology and exporting that surveillance technology to a lot of countries around the world. That's the thing that gets me scared, because that is the thing I'd mentioned about awareness might not save us from that. I don't know what that means. I fear a lot of things. Sometimes I'm paranoid. So, I wonder about that. But maybe the awareness thing is a solution to that, as long as I don't get personally identified with this body and this thing that I call Stewart, which might sound a little weird to a lot of different people, because it's like we're taught to grab onto our identities and believe that we are this body, even though after we die, everything inside of these bodies gets dispersed back into the universe and doesn't really change. Like all the material, it changes all the time, but the material, basic energy inside of our bodies doesn't disperse.
I think we have to think like revolutionaries without being isolationists, in the sense that we don't need to pull back and stop using these tools. We just need to be aware of what's happening. So, for example, don't give them personal information. If it's personal stuff, do it in something secure. If you have to get the Tor browser, get the Tor browser, whatever. And you're going to look at your medical stuff there, look at your medical stuff there. But when you are using them for entertainment, or like what we're doing, for research, where they are a benefit, Google's algorithms are to a benefit. Also keep in mind that what you're being passed off is, it's already been filed and sorted to an assumption on who you are. And remember, every once in a while, to step outside of that and to look for something else. Don't keep looking for the same things. Always look for something different every once in a while. And sometimes think like a virus. Search for things you don't actually care about just to fuck up their algorithm.
This feels like a question that I feel like my life is playing out, is how random and how many subgroups can I join, and how can I outsmart the algorithm, knowing that the algorithm has millions and millions and millions of dollars dedicated to figuring me out. And it's a common question I have, and I don't know if we have an answer.
Yeah, that'd be hilarious, right? If you're thinking like the algorithm, it's like, let's see, he is a member of this atheist group, but he's also a member of this Baptist church.
Yeah, exactly. Going on and liking Lady Gaga on Facebook, and then liking the Prime Minister of Australia, or
right,
yeah.
Or somebody completely homophobic, right?
Yeah.
You have, born like this, and then you have this person that is completely opposite, or searching for flat Earth and then looking at pictures of the globe.
Or talking to a scientist who is, about climate change or something like that. Something you mentioned is really interesting. I want to go into it because it's coming up on my spaced repetition. You talked about thinking like a virus, and it reminded me of this way that we can peer into how nature works. And if we, instead of creating something new that is like artificial, but everything's part of nature, so it can't really be artificial, we can look at what nature is like and then use that to build technology that mimics nature. And I've been learning about the immune system, as I mentioned earlier, and I found these like when a infectious agent comes into the body, the first things that attack it are antibodies, and they don't attack it. They just attach to that infectious agent, and then they mark it for destruction. And then another cell will come in and then attack that. And it's so interesting because like I feel like that is the way human beings fight wars almost. Like that's when you have the camera and you mark it and you sense it, and then send a missile at it. And so it's pretty far tangent from what we were talking about before, but I find that interesting. I don't know if you find it interesting as well.
Well, I don't think it's that far. I think that essentially what it says is, as human beings, we don't like being contained. Why do we create chaos? Even after, like you said, we're in a time of the best prosperity and health and economic equality that we've ever had in history. But we're slowly working towards chaos because to some degree, the human being is the chaos factor. That maybe life to some degree has to involve some sort of chaos. That we all are viruses in a way, right? If you ask the earth that's slowly warming up, what the human being is, it probably represents something closer to a flu virus to them or to it. Maybe we have to accept that part of our nature as well. I do think that there's a danger to going back to using, technologists manipulating the ideas of mindfulness to their advantage instead of really getting the point of it. But there is a danger to not seeing the full spectrum of the human, that there is part of us that is beyond, that is not even the observing self, but above the observing self, the higher self.
The substrate, yeah.
The thing that is pure. Yeah. But then there's also the part of us that's dirty, and the part of us that's chaos, and the part of us that's an asshole. That's part of who we are too. And the thing about the human being is not that we have one or the other. The thing about the human being is that's why the Tao is so important, is because we are the mix. We are the thing that is always seeking balance between the two, not the eradication of one or the other. So even within the Tao, there is a small dot of white within the black and a small dot of black within the white, because neither side is pure. And I think that's why I have trouble really connecting with a lot of the use of hallucinogens and things like that, because so many people use it as this idea to transcend. I don't want to transcend. I want to stay exactly where I am, and I want to deal with the struggle, because I think that's what makes us human.
Well, and there is no transcendence with a kind of a basic wanting of transcendence either, because transcendence encompasses both the wanting and the not wanting and stuff like that.
Right. And actually, now that we talk about, bring up psychedelics, obviously there are people who use it in a spiritually correct way. I believe that. But a lot of people are manipulating the same way we're talking about manipulating mindfulness.
Yeah.
Here's this tool to make me do this better. Like, that's not the point of it.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to have a shaman industrial complex pretty soon. I guess we're
it's like meditation Tuesday, ayahuasca Wednesday.
Well, you got to microdose it too.
Oh yeah. Although I've heard that is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I've experimented with it. It's the same thing. They're tools again, and as soon as we mistake the tool for the goal, we become trapped and build thought palaces of the things we do to get the thing that we can get, and instead of just kind of, I don't even, it's hard to put what is the goal? Do I know what the goal is? Have I reached the goal? I don't think I've reached the goal. I don't know. I don't know.
The consumer mindset is the problem, right? It's like, take this to do this. Whereas, some things have an innate purpose within themselves. And then they don't, it's not, you don't meditate so that you can get more work done.
Although getting more work done can be a byproduct of meditation.
Yeah, but it's not guaranteed, or at least it shouldn't be, right? Some people go through periods of chaos through meditation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was exactly how I got into it. I got into meditation. This was before I had Subase, before everything. It was probably about 8 years ago now. I got into it reading a blog of someone who was in the tech world who said meditation will make you more effective at your work. And so I started reading it. I was like, okay, I'm going to try it. I'm going to do 5 minutes a day. Oh yeah, you know what? I actually remember it. All right, so I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he was one of the original crew of Twitter, and he started this app which was called something else, eventually called Coach Me, and it was a habit tracker that was built off of the ideas behind The Power of Habit, this book. And so I would start really, really slow with like 1 to 2 minutes, and then I would check it off each day, and I'd build a 30-day streak of it, and then I would increase to 2 and then 5. And the whole time that was motivated by, I am going to get better so that I can do better work. And then that led me 5 years later, once I started to get into a medical issue, it was like, oh, I'm going to solve this medical issue by doing the meditation and going to the meditation retreats and doing all this stuff. And then it led me to a very, very, very dark place. That is going to be, I think, much more common very soon for a lot of people. Because I don't know about you, but there's something going on in terms of the world right now where it's getting a lot more stressful for a lot more people. A lot of crazy stuff is happening, and I don't want to get too mystical about it, but it seems like we are entering a period of stress. And as we both mentioned many times, even though our material benefits and our material lives are pretty good at an absolute basis, relatively there's more inequality, but at an absolute basis, we are more blessed than we've ever been materially. Even though that's a fact, we seem to be entering a time where people are starting to very, very much question the fulfilling nature of these material things, and are starting to look at these thousands of year old questions about humanity, about what it means to be happy, about what it means to find meaning. And it seems pretty stressful for a lot of people.
Well, I think also going back to the book that kind of brought us both here together at the same time, even though I haven't read it, I did do a little bit of research before we came in. So at least I understood the basic concepts, but Range, David Epstein's book, Range, he talks about the difference or the benefit of being a generalist as opposed to a specialist. I'm going to use that as an analogy here. Is if we are entering a period of stress, then it's very beneficial for us to be generalists in chaos, in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, if you can only think one way, if you have tunnel vision and you think you understand the world and this is the way the world works and this is right and this is wrong and there's no nuance, you're going to do really bad in that stress world.
Yeah.
Because that's not what you're going to be handed. Google's not going to hand you the perfect answer at the top of your search results in that chaos world. So being comfortable with nuance and being comfortable with something that people have forgotten, being comfortable with disagreeing with people and not making them your enemy. I had a wonderful interaction with somebody on Twitter. They started this app. I don't actually have the person's name because they use the app's name on Twitter, but it's the person who designed this app called Momentum. The website is momentum.earth because there's like 15 different things called Momentum out there. But we were talking back and forth. There's certain questions I had about, the way things functioned in the app. I was just looking at the demo and stuff like that. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And we had disagreement. I say, well, don't you think, for example, to make it a little bit more tangible, but not to get too in depth, they don't have repeating tasks. And I said, don't you think that, like you should have repeating tasks, like I want to do this every Tuesday. And he's like, well, we have this thing where you can copy. I was like, well, you're actually offloading the effort onto the user. Don't you think that that's asking too much cognitively of a user? And, he came back, he's like, well, this is the way I look at it. And we went back and forth. And when we ended the conversation, the tweet that he sent me was, thank you for this beautiful disagreement. And the praying hands and the smiley face with the sunglasses. And I was like, yeah, that was great. We disagreed, but I enjoyed the conversation. And that's the kind of thing that we need to prep ourselves for.
And it's this kind of neoliberal ideal that we're all going to get along and that everything's going to work out hunky-dory, just like it was in the fantasies that we all got fed when we were younger. It's like, the contrast. It's the like you said, I mean, we don't need all the contrast all the time, all the conflict like that. That's the way I grew up, and that wasn't that great either. But it's like there is this point at which you do need conflict. You need to disagree with people. You need people to disagree with you. You need to find somebody who will tell you the truth as they see it, even though it might not be representative of the truth in a larger sense. Like, you need to grapple with what other people think of you. And yeah, I absolutely agree.
I think actually you bring up a word that I think a lot of people don't understand: neoliberal. They think I know there's a lot of people out there think that when someone criticizes neoliberalism, that they're condemning the left. Like, that's not really what neoliberalism is. It's a weird offshoot of people who align themselves to the left, but are really in favor of a free market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the perfect example of that is where we are right now. The technologists in the Bay Area, a lot of them, either this or libertarians.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because that neoliberal thing, that was, I don't know if you read Francis Fukuyama, the End of History. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book called The End of History right after the Cold War. Is like, neoliberalism won. We have won. It's all over from here. We're all in this utopia now. And then with the rise of Trump, we can see how well that worked out. So it's like, yeah, it's interesting because it's like you're right. It's interesting.
All right. Well, we've got 5 minutes. You got to go do your breath work in 5 minutes. So I don't want you to miss that. Where can people find you online? Tell them where to find the podcast, where to find you on Twitter and so forth.
Totally. Yeah. So the podcast is named Crazy Wisdom. I do a lot of very similar stuff to you. Try to find the nuance in life, try to find the nuance in situations. And I also have one theme of creativity and stress. So what role stress plays in the creative process. And I've been interviewing a lot of people on that. I interview a lot of creative people, and you can find it on iTunes by searching for Crazy Wisdom. You can also on Spotify, on Stitcher, and all these different places. And if you do like the show, I'd love to communicate with people who do love the show on Twitter, and you can always reach out to me. I try to answer every DM that I get, and also reply to tweets that are sent to me. So you can find me at Stewart Alsop III on Twitter. Again, that's at Stewart Alsop III. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I don't do intros, so. His name is Stewart Alsop, if you didn't read the description of the episode, which some people don't do. And if you guys would like to help support this show, you can go over to Patreon, become a patron, Holy Fool Productions, patreon.com/Holy Fool Productions, where you'll hear the first 25, 30 minutes of this conversation that Stewart and I had about, I think we talked about Twitter, we talked about being podcasters in general, stuff like that. You can also follow Random Badassery on Instagram and Twitter. And please, if you're listening in Overcast, hit the star. And maybe if you're really nice, you'll rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, which is the hardest thing to get people to do. Do you find that's hard?
Yeah, I've found it pretty hard. Every time that I do an episode with Kapil Gupta, people just end up doing it. But yeah, it was difficult.
So one of the things I like to end with is, do you have any words of wisdom to end the episode?
Find range for the coming robotic apocalypse where everything specialized will become part of what machines do. And we'll need to find a way to figure out how to be more meta.